I'm Ali Jackson-Jolley. I am here with Kevin Goldberg, who is an attorney. He is also a First Amendment specialist for the Freedom Forum. Kevin, welcome and thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's going to be a busy 2024 for the United States Supreme Court, and I think one filled with drama, perhaps no more so than February 8th, when the United States Supreme Court has said they will hear the case to either keep candidate Trump on the Colorado ballot or to say that the state can keep him off of that ballot. Of course, former President Trump turned presidential candidate Trump is of who I speak. Can you tell us, what should we know about this case?
Well, I think you're right first that it's an important term all around. As you said, I'm a First Amendment specialist, and I follow First Amendment cases primarily, and by extension do follow the Supreme Court. There's 8 big First Amendment cases we're dealing with already, some of which are going to be very important, involving the future of social media. I've been tracking all those, but yeah, this one's kind of jumped to the top, and it does have some First Amendment implications. The case comes out of a lawsuit filed by a group of voters in Colorado who were seeking to have, as you said, candidate Donald Trump removed from the Colorado presidential primary ballot. The primary is coming up on March 5th. And they claim that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution says that anyone who is an officer of the United States but engages in insurrection against the United States is ineligible to run for president. The lawsuit was actually dismissed by a Colorado lower court. They did find, oddly, that Trump had engaged in insurrection, but they said that he was not, as president, an officer of the United States. That office is, oddly, not an office of the United States, and he was not an officer of the United States. The Colorado Supreme Court reversed that and did say he would be taken off the ballot. They provisionally stayed that ruling and said, no, okay, we're going to immediately freeze it. And we're going to give Trump the opportunity to seek review from the United States Supreme Court through a petition for certiorari. And if he files that before January 4th, then we will allow for him to be put back on the ballot. If he doesn't, we move forward. And he did. And now we're going to be in front of the Supreme Court on February 8th.
And so you mentioned that you are a First Amendment specialist. Is this a First Amendment case? Are there aspects of the First Amendment that we should be thinking about? Can you sort of talk us through how the First Amendment may come up in this case?
So is it a First Amendment case? Yes, and maybe no. It depends on kind of how the court resolves this. The First Amendment is in play, actually in 2 ways. There's a direct argument that Trump makes, which says he could not have engaged in insurrection because the basis for the claims that he engaged in insurrection were largely out of the claims that he had tried to overturn the results of the 2020 election through allegations that there was fraud in the process. These allegations were made publicly on social media and, most importantly, during a speech he gave on January 6th. And soon after that, of course, crowds rushed the Capitol trying to disrupt the confirmation of the 2020 vote, the Electoral College. And so what he's saying, however, is I didn't break any laws. Everything I said was fully protected First Amendment and therefore could not be an insurrection. If you punish me for this, then you're punishing anybody who speaks out on political matters. So that's the First Amendment issue at the case. There's another one that has been raised by 1 or 2 amicus parties, people who have filed friend of the court briefs trying to inform the court on other issues. And one of them said that removing Trump from the ballot would violate the First Amendment rights of the Republican Party to nominate its own candidate. I call that the more indirect First Amendment argument. I'm not sure the court will get to it. I do think the court will, at least during oral argument, discuss this question of whether Trump engaged in insurrection or whether his words were not protected by the First Amendment because he was actually engaged in something we call incitement to imminent lawless violence. However, even though I do think they're going to talk about this during oral argument, they may not actually resolve the case on this issue. There are a number of other off-ramps that they can use before they get to that First Amendment issue. There are a lot of questions within the 14th Amendment itself, such as whether this is a question that even should come before the courts or whether it's a political question best left to voters, whether president is an office of the United States for purposes of the 14th Amendment, whether the 14th Amendment is self-executing or Congress has to pass a law to make this happen. and whether it can even apply before someone is elected, or if it can only be invoked afterward. The court has all those opportunities to avoid reaching the First Amendment issue. But if they do, if they answer yes to all those questions, if all the questions and other non-First Amendment questions are answered yes, then they're going to go ahead and resolve the case on this issue of whether Trump's words were protected by the First Amendment or not.
Let's change directions for a moment and talk about the United States Supreme Court as an institution. It's an institution that for a large part of its history has enjoyed positive sentiment from the public, unlike Congress and sometimes the executive office or politicians. There's been a fairly high approval rating around the United States Supreme Court, in which there's been an idea that it is a apolitical institution. That started to change over the last couple of years, but most recently there was a Gallup study that showed that only 40% of the U.S. population would give the U.S. Supreme Court a positive approval rating. And so I wanted to talk to you about what you think this case may do for this court. Is there any way in which it will not be polarizing, or is this going to be a hard one for this court?
Well, it's definitely hard. There's so much at stake. I think, I, as I said, follow the Supreme Court mainly through the lens of the First Amendment. I write about every First Amendment case that comes before the court during each term for our website at the Freedom Forum. And, as they're ongoing, I watch oral arguments. I actually live about a mile from the Supreme Court, so I quite often go for First Amendment arguments in person. And so I follow the court generally as sort of a law geek type person, right? And so I understand what's at stake here, and I sort of get a feel for what this court is doing. This is going to be a case that will be polarizing without a doubt. Let's think back to maybe where some of the first allegations of politicization of the court came from. You could almost say it came from 2000, the last big election case, Bush versus Gore. We remember that, right? Where an election was decided by or finalized by the Supreme Court, and some people were very happy, some people were not. I think the stakes are somewhat similar here, and the implications for the future are somewhat similar. And I think the court, especially under Chief Justice John Roberts, takes this very seriously. He's very much a consensus builder. He also, I think the court generally likes to avoid taking on big constitutional issues if they don't have to. So the more narrow, the more procedural basis on which it could resolve an issue, it'll probably try. So if they can do that, if they can find an off-ramp to use that is narrow, procedural, not big implications, and one which allows for consensus across the board, that's what they're shooting for. That would avoid the First Amendment issues that I've been tracking. It's going to be hard, though. They don't have a lot of time to write a decision and to build consensus. That takes time. In a group as diverse in viewpoints as this current Supreme Court. So it's a tough haul. They've got to get this done, right? The Colorado primary is on March 5th.
Yeah, it's a good point. We are out of time. But to your point, we have about another month or so before things really heat up. I'd love to keep the conversation going, and I look forward to doing that with you in the future.
Thanks. Always happy to talk about this and the First Amendment.